All right, so this week we're going to take a dive into the world of camera lenses. And without a lens, obviously cameras don't really function. So lenses are extremely important to your photography. But the question is, why are they so damn expensive? This is obviously an extreme example here. This 800 millimeter f5.6 lens is currently on sale at B&H Photo for $16,000. Which I don't know about you. To me, that's a bit out of my price range. So we're going to take a look at some different specs on what we're looking at when we're talking about camera lenses. So typically a lens will be referred to in conversation by the focal length of the lens. You might hear somebody say, I'm going to be shooting this with an 18 millimeter lens, or a 65 millimeter lens, or a 300 lens, etc. Typically that focal length is going to tell you a lot about the image in terms of the angle of view. In other words, how much of the scene will be captured from side to side, if you will, as well as the magnification. So, if we look at a longer lens, a 300 millimeter lens, for example, it will have a certain magnification factor to it. So it will appear almost as if you're looking at the scene through a pair of binoculars or a telescope or something of that sort. So the focal length will give you a general idea of what the image will look like. So lenses fall into 5 basic categories. We typically think of the normal lens as being something that is roughly equivalent to what the human eye sees, which is about 50 millimeters. Anything that would be wider than 50 millimeters or smaller in focal length would be considered a wide-angle lens, and it will give you a field of view that is wide. And conversely, anything that's going to be a focal length that is more than 50 millimeters is what we would consider to be a telephoto lens, meaning it's going to give you some level of magnification that will make it appear as though things are larger in the frame. If you are shooting a telephoto that gets really long, say 300 millimeters or longer, we typically refer to those things as super telephoto lenses because they magnify to a greater level than what most photographers will need. Outside of those basic categories, then we also have a variety of specialty lenses, and the 3 most common specialty lenses are macro lenses, fisheye lenses, or what they call tilt shift lenses, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. Do pay attention though that these focal lengths of 50 millimeters, larger or less than 50 millimeters, is assuming that we are using a full frame sensor. We're going to talk about what that means here in just a second. So typically with the field of view, we talked earlier about how a wide angle lens is going to give you a broader view of the world. It will show more of the world in your image. So typically the shorter the focal length, say an 18 millimeter lens or a 24 millimeter lens or a 35 millimeter lens, the wider or the smaller that number, the more of the world that you'll end up seeing in the final image. That normal lens gives you a perspective that is roughly equivalent to the human eye. Telephoto lenses will give you a bit of a zoom factor that will kind of give you the feel that you're zooming in and getting closer to that subject, and the super telephoto takes that to the extreme. Super telephoto lenses are most common for special applications, most notably for sports and wildlife photography, where you just simply can't get close to the subject and you're standing some distance away and trying to fill the frame with your subject. So just to give an example of some different focal lengths, this is the same scene. This is not one of my images, but this is the same scene photographed from wide angle all the way through to a small super telephoto. So at 18 millimeters, we can see the entire landscape from this tree all the way over to the fence here. And as we get larger with our focal lengths, 24, 35, and so on, you'll see that it feels like we're zooming in, because quite literally we are. We are giving ourselves a longer focal length, which will show less of the image, but will show greater detail on that image. So when we see the wide angle image here, this little red fleck here is the barn, and by the time we get through these longer focal lengths, we'll see that barn getting larger and larger. until the barn fills, a quarter of the frame. So just as a comparison, I don't have the same image at 600 millimeter, which would be interesting. But most likely at 600 millimeter, this red bar would fill the entire frame. So I mentioned earlier that those focal lengths of 50 millimeters is based on the assumption that you're using what they call a full frame camera, full frame sensor. And so I want to talk a little bit here about what it means to be full frame and how that is different from what we refer to as a crop sensor lens or camera. For reference, anything that's a full frame camera or full frame lens is typically noted as being an FX lens or camera body. A crop sensor will often be designated as a DX, for a digital crop. So as we look at these things, it's important to know what that really means. So you can have a camera sensor that will be full frame, meaning that if you were to look inside of your camera underneath that mirror plate, there is a physical sensor that is the exact same size as an old school traditional sheet of 35 millimeter film, which measures 24 millimeters by 36 millimeters. You can also have a digital DX crop sensored camera, which is a little bit smaller. So if you were to open up that camera and look at the physical sensor, it's going to be a little bit smaller than a sheet of film. And it measures typically around 18 by 24, although that might vary a little bit depending on the camera brand. So what's important to note here is that camera sensors can be either full frame or crop sensor. And you'll hear that language consistently as you're looking at or talking to photographers about their work, whether you're using a full frame camera or a crop sensor camera. As you would expect, a crop sensor camera, being that it has a smaller sensor, will tend to be significantly less expensive. So if you look at entry-level digital SLR cameras, they will typically be your crop sensored cameras. So this would be in the Nikon line, it would be your D3000 line, D5000 line, D7000 line. In the Canon line, I believe it's the Rebel series, is completely crop sensor, although I could be mistaken, but I know that most of the Rebels, if not all, are crop sensor lenses. The full frame lenses or full frame cameras tend to be significantly more expensive. In addition to having a camera body that is full frame or crop sensor, you also can have a camera lens that is full frame or crop. So if you are using a full frame camera lens, that lens will actually project an image of the world against the sensor that covers the entire 24 by 36, that is a typo, 24 by 36 millimeter sensor. If you are using a lens that is marked as a DX lens or a crop sensored lens, that will project an image circle that is going to be smaller. It's going to be large enough of a circle to cover an 18 by 24 millimeter sensor. And again, just like your camera bodies, your full frame lenses will be more expensive than your crop sensor lenses or your DX lenses, because they just simply don't need as much glass, as much material to manufacture. DX lenses tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter weight, and considerably less expensive. So what does it matter if it's a crop sensor or a full frame sensor? What does it mean in terms of your image quality and your focal length and all of those different things? So we're going to take a look at that. This is a photograph that I shot at Genesee Village Country Museum. And this is photographed in infrared, which is why the grass looks white and the roosters look a little odd. But anyway, if we look at a full frame lens, this is a lens that's going to capture the world, that is, it's going to create an image circle inside the camera that will cover an entire 24 by 36 millimeter sensor, which is all cool. But if I'm going to be shooting a crop sensor lens, it's going to create an image or project an image circle, because lenses are round, they see the world round, but our images are square, rectangular. A crop sensor lens will project an image circle that is round, but is only large enough to cover an 18 or 16 by 24 millimeter image sensor. So the challenge that we run into is if we mount a DX lens or a crop censored lens onto a full frame camera, you can see that the lens is not going to be creating an image circle that is big enough to cover the full size of this bigger sensor. So if we were to shoot this with a full frame camera, we see this. The exact same lens put onto a crop sensor camera will yield you only this much, okay? And so if I look at these two images side by side, we have the full frame image on the left and the crop censored image on the right. Although they create the same image, because the crop sensor is cropped and it's smaller, it captures less of the world around it. When we capture this and then project it into a computer monitor or social media page or physical print, and we display them at the same size, they give the impression that the crop sensor image is zoomed in or closer to the subject. If you are talking to a photographer who's using a crop sensor camera, they may often refer to the fact that their camera has a 1.5x crop factor. And what they're really saying is that because of the smaller image sensor and the fact that it does create the impression of a closer zoomed in image, effectively what the crop sensor does for your focal length is to multiply it by that crop factor of 1.5 or 1.6 depending on the brand, but typically it's considered a 1.5 crop sensor factor. What that means is if I'm shooting a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame body and then I mount that same 50 millimeter lens onto a crop sensor body, it will yield an image that will be similar to a 75 millimeter lens. A 50 times a 1.5 crop factor gives you the impression of shooting that same image with a 75 millimeter lens. Sports and wildlife photographers love this factor because it is way cheaper and way lighter weight to be photographing with a 300 millimeter lens than a 450 millimeter lens, or a 600 millimeter lens versus a 900 millimeter lens. And so basically you're just getting the extra reach from that crop factor of that 1.5 crop factor. In addition to knowing the focal length of your lens, the other statistic that most photographers will be concerned about when looking to purchase a lens or use a lens is the maximum aperture of the lens. Typically they'll be labeled with an aperture number like an f2 or an f2.8 or the f4. We talked last week about what the aperture is. When a lens is marked as being an f2.8 lens, what that means is it can open up as wide as f2.8. It doesn't mean that the only aperture that the lens can be used at is f2.8. An f2.8 lens could be stopped down or closed in to a smaller aperture like an f4 or an f5.6 or an f8, probably all the way down to an f22. The wider aperture that your lens will allow more light to come into the camera, so you can actually create the same image, same exposure, with a shorter shutter speed, which is why those wide aperture lenses are typically known as fast lenses. So an aperture, a 1.8 aperture lens will be considered faster than an f4 lens. If you are comparing two lenses that have the same focal length but different maximum apertures, the lens with a wider maximum aperture with a smaller number will always be more expensive because of the wider aperture. It's more desirable because it gives you a little bit more range in terms of being able to get a faster shutter speed in low light. It also gives you the ability to blur out your backgrounds better. Last week, you'll remember we talked about aperture being what controls the depth of field or the amount of image from front to back that is going to be in sharp focus. So a lens that will stop down to 1.8 is going to give you a softer background or give you the option to give a softer background than using a lens that will only stop down to f4 or f5.6. So if you're shopping and you see the two lenses are on the same web page, they're both 50 millimeter lenses, one is an f1.4 lens, one is an f1.8 lens. You're like, what's the big deal? It's only, 0.4 or something. I don't know what that means, but if it's 0.4, that's not that much, and they're going to charge me, twice the price for that. A 1.4 lens is one stop faster than a 1.8 lens, and the price difference will show you the value that photographers place on having a wide aperture lens. Sometimes you'll see that a lens will be marked as a variable aperture. So if we look at this particular example here, it says 4 to 6.3. And that's because this particular lens is a zoom lens. It will zoom from 24 millimeter focal length to 50 millimeter focal length. The zoom range on the aperture will also dictate that on this particular lens, when you shoot it at 24 millimeters, you'll have a maximum aperture of f4. If you shoot this same lens at 50 millimeters, you zoom into 50 millimeters, the widest that you will be able to make that lens operate is at f6.3. So that is important because if you are, trying to shoot your portrait, say, at the widest aperture that you can, you want to get yourself into that 50 millimeter range, and your aperture is only going to open up to an f6.3. That will not give you the really soft, creamy, out of focus backgrounds that you'll see if you were to compare that same lens to a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens, which will give you much blurrier background than an f6.3 lens. We typically think of lenses, these variable aperture lenses are associated with zoom lenses, but there are zoom lenses that can actually maintain the same aperture throughout the entire focal length range. The 70 to 200 is an example. 70 to 200 f2.8 can be at f2.8, whether it's at 70 millimeters or at 200 millimeters. I have a 70 to 200 lens in my bag that is an f4 lens. So I can't open up as wide as f2.8, but I can shoot it at f4, whether I'm shooting it at 70 millimeters or 200 millimeters. So we are going to take a deep dive now into the actual lenses themselves. So we'll take a look at what it means to be a normal range lens, a 50 millimeter lens, what it means to shoot with a wide angle lens, a telephoto lens, and a super telephoto lens. We'll take a look at how that focal length will impact things like your depth of field as well as your magnification rates. And then we'll also take a quick look at some of the different specialty lenses with fisheyes and macro lenses and tilt shift lenses. So come on back, check out the next video on lenses, part 2.